of poetry, teaching the poems of Andrés Montoya. In the interest of time, I'm just going to briefly introduce the panelists, and then each will speak for about 10 or 12 minutes. And then we'll just go in order of how they're sitting on the table. And then we'll open it up for questions and comments for the remaining time. So our panelists are Nancy Hernandez, is a poet and graduate of Fresno State, right down at the end. Poet and graduate of Fresno State's MFA program. She's also a former recipient of the Andrés Montoya Scholarship in Creative Writing, and she currently teaches at Fresno City College as well as College of the Sequoias in Visalia. Cynthia Guardado is a Fresno State MFA graduate in poetry and former recipient of the Andrés Montoya Scholarship in Creative Writing. She is now a professor at Bullard College in Southern California, and her wonderful and bold first book, Endeavor, was published in 2017 by World Stage Press. Juan Guzmán is a Fresno State graduate in poetry as well, Fresno State MFA graduate in poetry and a former recipient also of the Andrés Montoya Scholarship in Creative Writing. He teaches at Fresno City College and he currently serves on the Cantabundo Organizing Committee and he's vice chairman of the Selma Arts Council. And Teresa Tarazi is a published poet and prose writer who's been teaching at Fresno City College for 20 years. She went to college with Andrés here at Fresno State and was a co-founder, along with Andrés, Daniel Chacon, and a few others of Chicano Writers and Artists Association. And she pioneered the first Latino Artists and Writers Conference in the Central Valley. So she goes way back with us. Okay, Nancy, you want to start?
Yes. Can everybody hear me okay?
A little closer.
Oh, yes.
Is it on?
Is this good? Yes, okay. All right, so as with the first, I heard the first panelist saying, oh yes, I remember, to acknowledge and thank everyone for coming here and for also for having me as well. So this is a little bit of my experience with Andrés, but also the reason why I also include Andrés in my classes. So Montoya teaches through his writing the fight for social justice and to use the voice that was given to us to create something that inspires hope and love. The very words Chacon mentions in his foreword that Montoya was told not to use in his poetry, but did so anyway. This optimism, or however much despair there may be in his writing, still inspires hope in my students. I remember one student noting the optimism in denial when Montoya writes, light bouncing off puddles created by a boy's despair as he kicks it with his friends in front of the shopping road by Radio Park on the corner of Clinton and First Streets, where they killed Louis. Juan said, Miss Hernandez, the light bouncing off the puddles, that is hope. My student lives in Fresno and knows Fresno in this same way. Like me, he grew up in the ghetto, on streets like Clinton and Blackstone, and played at Radio Park. I am that person too, and some of my best friends were and are people who couldn't escape the barrios, who smoked pot and who live in spaces that aren't always seen as hope or love. I am that person who didn't know how much her voice mattered because I was so often ignored and forgotten. And for these reasons, it is so necessary to teach his work in the classroom. Montoya's work is as much for students like himself as it is for those who are not like him, because they read his work and are given the chance to gain a better understanding of the diverse people who live in the valley. The lives Montoya wrote about speak to the realities that are often heard about but are so little appreciated. And if we want students to be interested in reading and writing critically, Montoya's work encourages students to do just that. As instructors, we are constantly thinking about student engagement, and Montoya's work is one of my go-tos, because when students read his poetry, they then often look at me like, is this real? They don't always expect his words because they had probably not come across voices like his in writing before. Through reading his poetry, my students get to see that their voices are not forgotten and that their experiences are shared, that they are not alone. Sometimes I think they feel what I felt when I first read Montoya, a sense of pride to read about Fresno from a person who is as imperfect as they sometimes I see that some feel just as cheated because their struggles have many times only been seen as social issues or public menace, but rarely as art. The Alley is another poem that my students relate to when he writes. Jesse's dead. He only wanted to take himself out, but the cops came and shot him 27 times. His mother came screaming, but Jesse never moved. The cops shook hands, giving congratulations all around. They survived well. Jesse's father tore at the dark skin of an old tree, looking for answers, nothing. The current social issues that play out in his work allow my students to see their concerns are important and that they are heard. Some have asked when these poems were written, and I have to tell them in the 90s and that he is no longer alive. One student called him a prophet. I said, maybe, but really he spoke about the issues that still need to be addressed today. And the conversations he created via his poetry provide a new perspective for all students and makes room for understanding of the people they share space with. Reading and studying Montoya helps develop their conversations about how they can and should create change in their own communities. His voice is needed in the classroom today for students living in the Central Valley because his word means representation. When I teach his work, I include women of color, Chicanx, Latinx, and other people of color. These are the voices my students oftentimes engage with the most. Part of that is because they are able to see themselves in these writers, and when they can see themselves in writing, they can develop their thinking and writing skills. His language is also one that they have more access to. His poems are written in contemporary language my students understand. In the poem, The Ice Worker Sings, my students understand. He liked this job because they let him alone. Here, everyone wore earplugs, and he was left in a room by himself to stack blocks of ice into rows of crystal perfection. Rows and rows, a huge army of petrified water standing at attention. There is no guessing as to what he means. They see how Montoya treats the tedious work of the ice factory as an art. And because my students don't have to guess at what is written, they begin to develop interpretation skills and conversation more quickly. This access to the language Montoya uses is one that relaxes my students when they are asked to think about poetry. Their fear and anxiety when asked to talk about poetry goes away because the fear of not understanding goes away. They know the words, they know the landscape that is written about, and this helps build confidence in their development of conversation surrounding poetry and prepares them to engage with longer texts or longer pieces of literature. Because using his work makes it so that my students trust their own language and their ability to articulate their own ideas because they trust that their words are good enough. When I think about the first time I read Montoya's work, I always remember Connie's advanced poetry writing course. This was the first time I had read his work, and one of the few Latino poets I had come across. I was in my second to last semester of undergrad, lived in Fresno, had grown up in Fresno, and this was the first time I had heard of him. I felt cheated that this was the first time I was reading his poetry from The Ice Worker Sings. Before him, I really thought writing wasn't something I was allowed to do. But after reading him, I knew I could pursue writing seriously. Montoya created the space for my work to matter because his work mattered to me. I know ice workers, poultry farm workers, water valve workers, Chicano factory workers, and Chicano students and like him and me. Teaching Montoya's poetry in the classroom has benefited students of the Central Valley, and I am certain the conversation has benefited students everywhere from whom we wanted to create engagement through accessibility of language. His work matters. Thank you.
context before I begin. So I came to grad school here at Fresno State, but I'm from Inglewood, California. And I now teach in North Orange County at Fullerton College. So I'm teaching this to a population of students who, in general, have no concept of what Fresno really is, right? And have never heard of Andrés Montoya, which is such a different context than Nancy's experience to be teaching at Fresno, right, or to students in Fresno. I'm going to begin with a couple of quotes from Andrés. He writes, "I'm going to dust this city's dirt from my clothes," from the poem Love at the Beginning. And here in the city that coughs, beauty is believed to be the fly that finally lies dead, from number 5. In poem 7, In a Jury of Trees, Andrés describes the altar of dead things. Andrés wrote, "The altar is on 5th Street between the dumpsters and City Hall." He continued to describe the altar as the keeper of words, faith, hope, love. Andrés creates a Fresno full of despair, and it is also his own despair over not having a Fresno filled with progress and the love that layers and layers in his poems. In the middle of all of this, he writes about his belief in nothing and everything myself. Studying literature, composition, and creative writing in the United States is often one of the most difficult journeys for a student of color to venture on. At least that was very emblematic of my experience as a lit student at UC Santa Cruz, and even here as an MFA student at Fresno State. I often felt I was trying to survive through courses which taught me very little about writers I could connect to or engage with on any personal or cultural level. As a professor, I do everything in my power to subvert the hierarchical systems of what is literature or what is academic. And I truly feel that Montoya's work exists in direct opposition to the status quo of poetry. Because his use of language, of a common tongue, both you and I can understand and connect to, are part of his personal revolt against standard English and hierarchy. In my creative writing class at Fullerton College, I teach Montoya's work to teach students about place, language, and thematic writing. I often teach the following poems together: Denial, Starstruck, and Locura from the Ice Worker Sings and Other Poems, and Spanish Vernacular from the Jury of Trees. Each of these poems paint Fresno through the cracks in the concrete and tears and weeping. The word despair is present in each one of these poems and creates a new kind of despair about life and Fresno. Montoya creates place by writing, as Juan Felipe Herrera said last night, about what's really going on. Montoya writes about the ugly and the beautiful, and he also makes space for people who rarely make it into poems because they are people we often ignore even when we pass them on the street. In Locura, he writes about the bones stacking up, murdered by pipes and cops, and just a few words later writes about viejitos sipping tea or lovers loving behind bushes. These images paint a picture for my students of what walking through the streets of Fresno look like, and as a writing exercise can teach students about truly witnessing their own communities. After discussing the poems, we end with the writing exercise where I ask them to write about a place, and in particular, I want them to focus on a place they consider home. My students are typically unfamiliar with Fresno, and often have a one-sided view of Fresno. Many people in Southern California or the greater Los Angeles area often dismiss Fresno as a place filled with drugs and nothingness. I often spend my time trying to explain to people how amazing and beautiful Fresno is. And when I teach Montoya's poems, instantly they become aware of the art and poetry that exists in Fresno. Through his poems, they are able to see rain falling for days, lions marked in beautiful graffiti growling in reds and yellows, the sounds of frogs and crickets, and feet always hesitating, content with despair of the dying city of progress. Through these images, my students are able to see and hear Fresno, and at times, Montoya even lets them taste it through the savored crush of an anguished peach. I asked them to analyze the poem Starstruck and look for each time Montoya is appealing to their senses, and through this activity, they not only have to look closely at Fresno, but they also learn about metaphor and detailed description. Through these poems, my students learn that they too can write from their own experience. Montoya teaches them that they can choose their own language, just as he does in his poem Locura, where he writes, "A cohete tucked in the back of my baggies and a 40 in my right hand, imagining myself some kind of cholo. Here Montoya creates his own cultural language and rhythm, and there is a kind of song in the alliteration of cholo. I just like saying that. Enough that I can imagine it in the chorus to some undiscovered Selena song. It is in his language that I truly believe Montoya's poetry exists as a teaching tool to dismantle what people believe poetry should look and sound like. And this is why it is especially important to teach Montoya to writers. Although there is a lot of despair in all of these poems and much of Montoya's work, he reminds us in Spanish vernacular that even after Miguel is dead, we can have hope because somehow the stars are talking about hopes and clouds. The sky and stars and light appear in his poems over and over again to remind us that there is something beautiful out there in the universe. My students always comment on the following lines from Starstruck. He writes, "My feet caressing the cool kiss of the ditch, and there I would breathe, really breathe deep, as if sucking the stars into my chest, as if I was taking life forever into my soul." At the end of the day, it is this hope that Montoya leaves us with. My students are able to connect to the despair and the hope, and learn that it is okay to write about who they are and where they come from in the language of their choice. I myself was never fortunate enough to have been taught Montoya at Fresno State or at any level of my education, but I was often taught about poetry through this community in Fresno. I know that I learned more from them, the writers of Fresno, about what it means to be a poet. And it is like this that Andrés Montoya came to me at the old review in Tower, when a friend sat with me and brought The Ice Worker Sings and other poems. He said, "You have to read this." On that afternoon, Andrés also joined us for poetry and coffee, the way he will continue to join others every time we share and teach his works. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. I want to start just by saying too how thankful I am to be on this panel and a part of this conference. I've always considered Andrés a padrino of mine, especially as I entered into the writing world. I discovered his work as an undergraduate here at Fresno State. I knew that I wanted to be a writer, but I didn't know that I didn't know how to write. I was in a writing class with Martin Paul. It was I had to write an essay where I had to analyze a piece of literature. And I submitted my essay, what I thought was an essay, and at the end of the class, when he was passing the papers back, that day he gave me mine back and he said, "This is not an essay, but you should be writing poetry. Find Connie Hales." And I did, and I went to Connie Hales, and Connie Hales mentioned Andrés Montoya, And after that, I went to the Selma Public Library, and I feel so guilty doing this in a library. I never returned it. I kept it. I had to keep it. I mean, so it was an awakening, right? And it led me. I was already writing. I was writing fiction at the time, and I had this little short story that I had been working on, and Connie told me about the Andrés Montoya Scholarship Prize, and I submitted it and I won. And for me, that was like, okay, this guy was from Fresno, right? Who writes about Selma? Like, who knew about Selma, which is where I'm from? And so I felt guided, and I felt like this was the right thing to do. And so that was when I made the decision to join the creative writing program here at Fresno State. Because I've always felt a connection to Andrés and to his work, although I never had the pleasure to meet him. So I want to just I tell you that story for two reasons, because first thing, it was a moment where I realized as a writer about rhetorical modes, right, that certain essays have specific purposes. I couldn't write an essay where I'm analyzing something the same way that I would write a poem. But I also learned that if I didn't have the confidence to enter the page to begin with, that I would never get to writing the analytical paper, that I would never get to writing the argument or the research paper. I needed to be able to find my voice on the page first, right? And poetry and creative writing allowed me to enter that space, where I could then form my language, form that writing into a writing that could go across any kind of rhetorical mode. So I was, everything happens on Twitter nowadays. I was on Twitter, and D.A. Powell tweeted this, and I thought, wow, that's really cool. A poem is a narrowing to create a widening. A poem is a narrowing to create a widening. And I thought that that's so appropriate when I think about Andrés' work and how I can bring it into the writing room, right? So I want to talk a little bit about how I use Andrés' poetry in the composition classroom, which is primarily the courses that I teach. And for the most part, the way that I do it is I link it to how students learn to write the narrative essay. Andrés' work is very narrative. It has a lot of narrative qualities, and I find that that's really helpful to help to teach students how to enter the space of a narrative essay and eventually form their voice so that they feel more confident to write the argument and the research papers. So a poem is a narrowing to create a widening. The image that I get from that is that of a prism, right? When light enters this prism and comes out, there's just so many possibilities that are created. And so a poem is a narrowing to create a widening. In search of Aztlán from the Iceworker Scenes. I came looking for Aztlán, but couldn't find it. It had been hidden with names like Fresno, Parlier, Early Mark. I came asking questions of my family, but my family could only remember how the last paycheck was swallowed mysteriously by the valley's hot air. This narrowing creates a widening in my students' perspective and in my students' understanding of what is allowable on the page. And so I really find that, especially when working with, because the argument is narration important to teach in a composition class, and I find that it is incredibly important. Not only, and this is like research, does writing narrative have like therapeutic and healing qualities, right? But again, it gives that students the agency to enter the page. They feel empowered to take control of their story. And I find that when we connect, and again, this is my students, Fresno City College, Hispanic serving institution, half the population or more identify as Latino students. It's not rare that in my classroom, 90% of the students or more are Latinx students. And so they certainly do relate to the material that they see on the page. So when we talk about the narrative essay, this is a prompt that I might use, using the conventions of narrative essay writing on write a 4 to 5 page MLA style essay that reveals something significant about you, someone you know, or the world around you. This essay should be set in a Fresno-based location, or it can also take place at the location of your first job. Two kind of things that are embodied in Andrés' work, right? So up to this point, what have we studied in the classroom? Well, we've studied the elements of narrative writing. They know that narrative essays should make a point, should share something significant about their experience. They know about organizing a narrative essay. We spend a lot of time reading narrative essays. At this point, they might have read Shooting an Elephant by George Orwell, or Grandmother Mother's Victory by Maya Angelou. At this point, we've also read the essay Shitty First Drafts by Anne Lamott. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but it's a great piece that really encourages students to just kind of jump in and start writing. So at this point, we've discussed the conventions of narration, we've read narrative essays, we've worked to analyze them, we've studied key elements of writing like setting, like language, like the things that my colleagues here mentioned. And so a lot of students feel, these are quotes from some of my students, I interviewed them this last week, how do students feel about poetry? Well, some students say, I really like poetry. To me, it's something that's really deep and meaningful because poetry is not easy. I've really never understood poetry and found it confusing at times. The only time I actually read it is in school when I have to. I believe poetry is beautiful. It's like drawing. It paints a good picture, but it's different. My opinion to me is that poetry is like another language that very few can speak. And so what I tried to teach them, and what comes so easily, right, we've been talking about the accessibility of Andrés' poetry, although I agree to deceptively accessible, is that a text is a text, right? And so take the word poetry out of it, and when you read from Andrés' poetry, it's like you're reading from segments of a narrative essay. This is an excerpt from Locura. Every day I walk through the cracking streets smelling despair like a rose. I ride on buses freshly laced with the stench of some borracho's vomit, and there are bones and more bones stacking up around me, murdered by pipes and cops, knives and guns, or just the evil glare of some rich gala. And not the vehicle sipping tea or the lovers loving behind the bushes in the park can make me smile or laugh or see some glimmer of hope in this crazy cosa called life. A text is a text, and so when students read this, they begin to see key elements of a narrative essay present here. A command of voice, right? The use of tone, how much is revealed through character just by internal monologue or dialogue, figurative language, sensory details, description, imagery, and they're beginning to see put into practice all of these elements that we've been studying in the classroom through the work of Andrés Montoya. One of the questions that I asked them too, how often do you relate to the material that you read in your English classes? Here's what some of my students had to say. I usually force myself to find something to relate to, otherwise it's just not interesting. One student just wrote, no. Prior to this class, I never even thought about relating literature to myself. I realize now it's something I should be able to do. And this final quote, with the books I've read recently for classes, in no way have I had any major connection to the author, writing, characters, and so on. Closest thing may be age and typical goofy things that they do. In a way, I think it's important because you'll feel more aware and more intrigued. I guess what I really want to say is that, and my colleagues have echoed this, and I'm sure Teresa will echo the same in some way too, is that the work that Andrés has created is not only understandable and relatable to many students, but it gives them permission to enter the world of writing and to enter the world of reading. And it does that by validating a lot of their own experiences, right? Like the chulo cholo, right? I'm sure my students know a lot of chulo cholos, right? And so it really gives them permission to enter the world of writing. It allows students to see the elements of narrative writing at work. And so what I would have them do after we study some of Andrés' work is let's write some flash poems that are based on that narrative prompt about a place or your first job. And here's some examples. This is Leslie C. Though the night is still in the shadows of Fresno, a body lays sleeplessly awake in dire need of some air. The kind of air that plays with the lashes of the eyes that move quickly to spot any sort of movement that creeps in the alleys. The kind that awakens the body with goosebumps and plays with the mind by creating thoughts of a better tomorrow. But the air isn't playing tonight. It's humid and stale, it's hot and sweaty. It's the kind of weather Fresno likes to play with. Only 16, I begin to work like an adult, climbing the ladder, picking the fruit, making sure I don't fall. In the hot Fresno sun, I'm pretty sure I might faint. The air is dry and stiff. My face is so warm it feels as if it's on fire. My hands are dripping sweat like an icicle melting slowly. The big machine turns on and I feel a cool breeze that cools my whole body down as if I'm on top of Millerton Lake. At 16, I didn't want to work, I wanted to be free, spending time in a pizza parlor, watching the tree leaves sway with the wind breeze, faking a smile as people came in, times going by fast with all the bodies swarming in. When my shift would end, I was happy to be free, just an average 16-year-old with no responsibilities, working just to buy my own things. I saved my mom lots of money so she didn't need to buy my jeans. I actually missed those days. I would make lots of friends, all my favorite customers. I wonder how they've been. Even students writing in Spanish and exploring their first languages. No tengas miedo de quedar en soledad cuando sientas que el mundo se derrama a tus pies. Y cuando sientas la presión de la tristeza y la desesperación, y si a gritos pide al corazón encontrar la causa y la razón, no temas que no has quedado en plena soledad. So, what I find valuable with this, right, is because their essay, of course, is not going to be a poem, but it's an entrance, right? Because, again, a poem is a narrowing to create a widening. And so, at the end of this, students have their own little prisms, right? Their own little entrances to be able to explore the widening of their narrative essay.
I have a PowerPoint, but it seems that a lot of the points have been made, so I won't take you through that. Instead, I'll take you more through a journey of how in the classroom I would present Andrés. And one of the ways that I like to present Andrés is as a student. This is Pachuco Children Roll Stones. This is a first edition, so I love this. And I tell them about our experiences as students at Fresno State and finding our voice at Fresno State in Ruben Sanchez's class and also in Connie Hales's poetry class. And I talk about how, smoking weed before her class, chilling out, talking about God and all the good stuff. And I don't know, it seemed like we were always late. Always late. But I try to share those experiences because I want them to know he was a student. I was a student. We were grappling with who we are as individuals and finding ourselves, our identity, our voice. He was white and Mexican. I was Mexican, but because I'd been brought up in foster homes with white people, I was white and Mexican. And we were trying to understand who we were. And I ended up going as English, but I was kind of off from the group. I was hanging out with them because they were fun. I met Andrés actually at a pool hall here at Fresno State. He called me Pool Shark. I beat the guys, got my dollar. And so we hit it off, and he introduced me to Danny, and we clicked because we have this passion for justice, for Latino justice, for finding our voice. And so we were part of different things on campus, but going back to this idea of identity, we struggled too in what we wanted for our lives, how we were going to approach our education. I know Andrés, I believe his major was history. I think yours was political science. Mine was English, but it was English because my aunt, who's a lawyer at that time, told me, don't take political science. Don't take philosophy. Go into something different, and then you'll get more, ability to get into a law school. So English was always easy for me, so I went into English. Or I felt it was easy. I don't know, some of my grades didn't show that. But the guys, were always like, come on, let's write poems. Let's write fiction. Let's hang out. Let's talk about writing. And I was like, I'm not a writer. I'm a lawyer. I'm going to be a lawyer. And it was, you're not a lawyer, you're a writer, you're a teacher, you're not a lawyer, and we'd go back and forth. And so, this idea of trying to find ourselves, and I tell them they're going to go through that. They're going to go in one way and find themselves in another way, to allow that space to happen, to that journey to happen. And part of that is standing up with courage against the tide of fear that would keep your voice suppressed. And so one of the things that we used to do was to guerrilla poetry reads. Get that mic out there on the quad and just start reading our poems, right? Just open it up and read it. And I was just, wanting to be out there. Yeah, everyone's gonna shut us down. We have cojones, right? This attitude. But one of the things that it came is that it didn't matter if someone liked our poem or didn't like it. It mattered that we said it. that we established, that we were putting a stake in the ground. This is our world. This is what we believe. This is what we want to say. And on that, the putting the quad together really helped, with legitimizing also our voices and hearing it. And I remember Andrés going through one of my poems, and he cut out, like I wrote this long poem, and he just sliced it down to like 10 lines. I'm like, what the heck? What, because he was pretty brutal, as we should be, to really get the best out of each other. And he said, take all the frivolous stuff out, get to the point. Get to the point. I really always appreciate that. And we tell the students, getting to the point, getting all of the mess out, getting all of the tears and the cries, and get to that point that really expresses who you are. And so I teach them about Plato's forms. And we talk about that a little bit, where Socrates, that ideal form, kind of want to copy that ideal form. But with Plato, it was like, no, push yourself out of the boundaries of that, because idealism is where you want to go, and you can find it in many different ways to say the same thing. So instead of telling about that apple, right, you want them to taste the apple. And so I like, kind of when you're talking about your line, I like the mocos a my bocote. And if anybody knows that line, it's Andrés used to share his uncle wrote a poem, and that was a little phrase that really helped him to start to write, because poetry, there was nothing sacred and everything was sacred. And as students, they come in and they're fearful. They are afraid of how they're going to say it, what they're going to say, or if they're making any meaning in what they're saying. And this allows them that freedom of language to have fun with it and to play with it and mix it up and cut things out and put things in. And so going from that, I like to share with them the being born, and talk about rhythm and language and the visceral, that duende, right? That angst in our spirit, our soul, that can't be put into words necessarily. And we try to put it into words. We try to paint that picture. And being born, I especially like, I know somebody just mentioned the review. I used to, Andrés and I, a group of us used to go there to, weekly to go write poems. So someone, each time had a different prompt to bring. And Lauren, one of our friends, brought the prompt about being born. So we went off to go write, about birth and whatever, and came back. And this is the poem. He didn't change anything. This is the poem that he wrote. Being born. I was born in 1978 from asphalt and the beat-up bumpers of Chevys on 4th and Vine, on San Jose's south side. They keep telling me it was raining and the lightning was licking the streets up and down as if the world was a cheap motel room with cockroaches propped up on the pillows. They keep saying it was a sign, the rain and its lightning, of my darkness. They say I was meant for evil. They say what else can come from a syphilitic John and his Saturday night whore? But it ain't so. I keep waiting for the clouds to bust out in lights. I keep waiting to hear a trumpet so fine that the man Miles will bow his knee. I keep waiting to hear the man say, good going, Tommy, you all right. They say I was born from a witch's womb. I'm telling you, I was born in 1978, bowing broken on a Chevy's bumper, my knees digging into asphalt and glass and a puddle of gunk on 4th and Vine on San Jose's south side. My chest heaving a lifetime into the air, the moonless night. I was born in 1978, sobbing Christ from my lips. And when they hear that this came from a prompt, right? And I tell them we've been writing prompts. And they say, this is a prompt. This is practice. This is something that you put out there, and then a jewel comes out like this. But it is about sharing with one another, about being in a group of people, of writers, and again, as everyone said here, learning to have that voice and to share that voice. And one of the things that I like about the Ice Worker Seas is that it's a metamorphosis. He starts off searching for Aslan, but he ends with, through the poems, I determined to know nothing but Christ and him crucified. The Andrés that I hung out with, you know, when we talk about the going from, you know, the kind of punk kids that we were and trying to find ourselves and smoking weed and doing all the different things to get that identity, he found his identity. And that's what's so powerful about this, because he takes us on this journey of identity, and that metamorphosis happens right in front of us. And there's this welcome entrance. Come, join me, find that place for yourself, find that metamorphosis. And I have students like Joseph Rios, who came to my class, who was about to get kicked out of City College. And I was teaching Puente at the time, and he came into the composition class and really struggled. And I read to the class out of Ice Worker Sings and taught them about Andrés, and he was just excited, this burning, and started reading more of Andrés's work and reading more writers like Andrés. And now he is a writer. So someone, a student that was taken, like would have went back to his uncle's paint shop and just worked because he was, you know, at the verge of losing, you know, kind of the education that he was wondering about, you know, searching for that identity, and he finds his identity in this book, through this book, I should say, and it has his own metamorphosis. And so teaching Andrés is important in that we can help students unlock that in themselves. So starting with this idea of Andrés as a student and in search of, and then finding who, you know, who he was as a person and established in Christ. So thank you for letting me share.
Okay, questions, anybody? Comments or questions?
I have a question.
Okay.
Okay. In terms of making a place and creating space for writers of color, how important was it for you to read writers of color, and when did that happen for you? And because you read them, was that one of the reasons that validated your need to write and created your yearning to continue to write? So how did like, for instance, how Andrés inspired Joseph Rios, how did that kind of like create a space for you? And do you think you're creating a space for other people after you?
Well, for me, I think that it was absolutely the most important. The only writer, poet that I remember really understanding that really connected with me was Salvation with Hughes. And I remember thinking, like, with Langston Hughes, I was like, why is, you know, why isn't there more of this? And Maya Angelou. And there were other great poets, you know, that again, I was in Connie's class, and she taught a lot of different poets that had valuable and wonderful pieces and really spoke to us as humanity-wise. But a person of color, that was like, I can't even express how important and how powerful, because I felt like they could understand me. I remember one time I was in Philip Levine's class, and he said, I wrote about my mother who was a drug addict and a prostitute, and I said, and he said, well, you really need to work on this, and we started, and I said, wait a minute, I said, have you ever read Chicano literature? And he's like, you know, kind of, what? And I said, have you ever read Chicano literature? He said, well, no, I mean, I said, then don't talk to me. I'm telling Philip, but I was this, you know, badass Latina, and I'm like, you're not gonna tell me. And he said, you know, why don't you come around? He goes, great writers work on things, and they work on it for 20 years. And I'm thinking, 20 years? That's forever, man, you're old. I'm like, this is now, right? And of course I understand it now, but that idea though was not to his discredit, because really, you know, the immaturity that where I was at, but I don't think that having a person of color, the significance of that is I can't speak to how powerful that is, and how it was for me, and Joseph Rios and others that are seeing the voice and the face of somebody that they can truly identify with.
So in terms of poetry, I've never been, unless I went to Bona, I've never been taught writers of color. So in terms of poetry, so my entire education. And then as a lit major, there was only one professor at UC Santa Cruz. He is half Japanese, half Jamaican, half Chinese. He is the only professor we had that taught us any writers of color, but he taught us fiction for lit courses, so we didn't read fiction and nonfiction, we didn't read any poets. But that to me was really monumental. Out of the 4 years I was at UC Santa Cruz, or 3 there and then 1 year in England, that was the most powerful classes I took were with him. His name is Louis Chutsomi, and then last time I checked he was at a university out in Washington. But it's so monumental, I still have my copies of the books from those classes. I teach Kindred by Octavia Butler now, using my original copy from when I was 19 years old in my classroom, right? So for me as an instructor, right, as a professor, it's incredibly important to teach writers of color. My courses are pretty much constructed like 98%, writers of color. And then, there was this sort of thing going on with a student last week, and I was talking to my coworkers about it, and they were like, well, you don't have to teach white writers, they're getting that everywhere else. And then I was like, yeah, but I'm a woman of color teaching in Orange County, and I don't want to get like this whole, you're discriminating by not teaching white writers, right? So I still include them. It's not like I do read white writers, but I'm creating mostly the majority of my courses are going to be writers of color and from like every culture, right? I'm really trying to pride myself to be as diverse as possible, because I don't know every background of all the students sitting in my room, right? And I'm trying to provide something where each one of them can at least find one thing that we read that they can connect to. And even if it's only one thing, right? But hopefully they're connecting to a lot more than that.
And I wanted to add to that, or to what we've been discussing so far about that, is that in undergrad, for the most part, and through most of my college experience, I remember only reading Langston Hughes, Toni Morrison, and Maya Angelou. And here and there we got Sandra Cisneros or someone like that, but there was something different when I read Andrés Montoya. It was just something that for me I was able to, wow, that's me. Like, I'm not a man, but the experiences that he wrote about were also my experiences, or many of my shared experiences. And so, I did mention that it was the second to last semester for me when I first came into contact with Andrés Montoya, and I was just like, I did feel cheated, because I thought, how is it that I have lived in Fresno 20+ years at the time, and have never experienced his writing, and have never experienced a voice so much like my own, and so I needed, and I felt, as a result of that, I want to make sure that my students know that he is available to them as well. So that's why I also teach him.
And I'll just add that it's incredibly transformative, right? I think either way, if you're going to be a writer, you're going to find a way to write, and you're going to write because it's in you and you have to write. But when you discover work that speaks to you on the level that Montoya's work speaks to us, it transforms you. For me personally, it gave me permission to write about Selma and going to the Uva with my parents when I was a kid, right? It gave me the permission to enter the space with my own perspectives. Alex Espinosa tells a story about how before he encountered writing by people of color, he was writing short stories set in London that were like foggy, and that was like what he had, right? And we're writing odes and stuff, and so I think when you discover a voice, when you're on this journey as a writer, it has the power to transform what you're writing.
When Andrés and I were at the University of Oregon getting our MFA, we were going to a party at Garrett Hondo's house, who was the director at the time. Tanya was at that party. And the music was playing, and there was a song that came on that, I forget the name of it, but take a load off me, take a load. Is that one? Just got into Nazareth. And, and Andrés and I were listening and go, wow, man, they're Christians. Because they were talking about Jesus and Nazareth, and so I said that to Connie. I said, yeah, they're Christians. She goes, I don't remember exactly how you said it, but essentially what you were saying is metaphor and culture that they're interacting with, not religion. And I'm wondering, when you teach Andres's poems, it's very Christ-centered, and it's in your face Christ-centered. And I'm wondering how you negotiate that as metaphor and culture when you talk about those poems to a student that might say, is he a Christian?
I'm pretty up in front about it. In fact, that was part of my presentation, and the fact that he is constantly, in terms of forms, reaching out to Christ in many different ways. And he says, you know, Christ, Christ, or he says, you know, to be a part of Christ. Even the love letters, the passion that he has, is about Jesus. It's about his meaning. The contemplation from concrete night movements, for example, you know, his fear. A lot of people I think that that's just a love poem, but this is to God. This is his passion, his love for God. The pulling back, the coals to the mouth. This is his desire. And so I don't think that we should pull back from his love for Jesus and his metamorphosis in terms of his salvation into Christ, because I think that it helps students to understand they can find what is their metamorphosis. They can find that passion and go through that identity where, you know, the transformation that they need to go through. So in terms of negotiating, well, you know, how do we reconcile that? I don't know if you have to really reconcile it as much as to say this is who this person, you know, that where the crux of their passion and their poem, where it comes from, right? That flow, that river of life comes from. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's why I kind of see that just let him, he is speaking it, and let him speak that, and then they have to negotiate from there their own place of where they're going to transform.
Well, yes. I think for myself, because I'm not ultra religious, I had been at one point, but that's my transformation, I guess. But I do often see how his use of religion and God in the work does comment on this idea about the hope and the passion, you know, and then what's true of many of my students, they are also religious, you know, and for them being able also to relate to that and to see that in the work and how it develops their conversation helps, I think, develop for them and reassure them with that same hope that they're often looking for as well. So
I just wanted to add that, I mean, I don't really address it in that context. I think religion and faith are different things to me. And I think that there is a lot of sort of like faith and hope in the work, and that we can ask students, or I think the message that's larger for me is that to have faith and believe in something, so that, because if you don't have hope or believe in something, then all there is the despair. Like I personally, I don't believe in any organized religion, but I grew up Catholic and extremely Catholic. Like I was even confirmed, right? Even still up to 15. So regardless, that religion is a part of my culture and it's in my poems because that's how I grew up and it's part of my cultural traditions. So I think that there's also a way to interpret the way that he writes about that, about like what his cultural tradition or cultural space is.
Yeah, I think contextualizing it to what I presented on just now is looking at the transformation too, knowing that in a narrative essay you should know where you want to end and what causes you to get, what are the details that lead you to that ending. And so I think that in the way that looking at it objectively helps my students kind of make that journey with it.
I had a question. I feel like a lot of, even at the K-12 level with Common Core and at the community college level, so much more pressure to get students to be writers with an argumentative research writing. And I'm wondering to what degree you guys feel that's also going to might hurt some of the progress writers of color have done to be able to get into, you know, more curriculum and so on, with more focus being based on informational, argumentative sort of writing, and how, I don't know, I mean, I just kind of want to see what you guys' thoughts are on some of the, and do you guys see that as well as educators in sort of seeing some of this push towards more research writing and sort of how it might affect, you know, some of our community?
Right. The first thing I'll say about that, because, you know, I have all these like dreams and goals about all the research I'm gonna do that I have no time for right now. But one thing about that is sometimes I think about it is especially as writers of color, sometimes in terms of research, we can think that we almost have somewhat of a blank canvas. Because there's actually, once you start digging, not a lot of research on the things that like I would like to see, right? In terms of like even that question that you're asking, like how does like what we teach and research-based writing impact in particular students of color, right? And you know, it's another, you know, example of maybe structural and institutional racism, right? And I think that that's why I talk so much about the language that, you know, Andrés chooses to write about, because it's another way to sort of subvert like that standard English or hierarchical writing, right? But I think that as for any like, you know, any Latino writer, especially youth moving forward, right? I think to encourage them to research what they want to research, because we have, right now we have the opportunity to create the research that actually does not exist. So there is a vast amount of research on us culturally, and looking at what that impact is on our, you know, education or our development or what we choose to do.
I think that's a really important question, and I've actually taught in English 3 this idea about, let's say with Walt Whitman, and he had to kind of basically self-publish, right? And that the time when we're looking at England and what the powerful publishers kept out, basically, of writers coming in, and that's happened with people of color. We've had to do a lot of self-publishing because we were kept out. Even if you go to the bookstores, I remember even with Danny's book and Andres' book, we'd go to the bookstore, Barnes Noble, yeah, and where's the book? Or there's this sliver of just a tiny bit of, you know, Latino writers. You might have some more South American writers, but for Chicano writers, very small sliver. And so in the critical thinking, the English 3 classes, we talk about, again, how the voice is kept out through the publications, through the magazines, through various things, and that we have to be research oriented to understand how to fight against that. And how it's not just poetry, right? It's music, it's plays, it's the arts in general. And so this is something that if there's any research done in one aspect that is going to change the world, there's a poem too behind being able to change the world, being able to influence people, impact them for, you know, when we think about the Harlem Renaissance, for example, and the poems that came out of that whole genre of America, you know, I'm the brother too, right? So it's this idea that we have to keep that flame burning, and we can do it through research. And in fact, the research will show that we have to keep that flame burning. In terms of fighting the K through 12, however, I think it goes back to that one question really quickly, and that's basically having to keep fighting where it rolls back, because I think that it's rolling the other way right now. We have to keep fighting to get it to roll back.
I was just going to echo that part, right? That there are already so many institutional changes in states, changes coming down the state lines too, that are already affecting our students and that are going to affect, especially as students of color in pre-transfer and developmental courses. And so that's the frame of mind to have it.
Other questions?
I'm interested in this area of the quote, finding your voice. Students, your experiences with students, in getting them to arrive at that point where they find their voice, if they didn't have one when they entered your class. I'm interested not only in the part of finding your voice, but what happened to that voice as it was, in your understanding, where did the voice stop being expressed? Because it's real small children. There is nothing in the way of children expressing themselves at birth and just after. I mean, there's there's sounds, there's words, it's all coming out. What happened to that voice in your experience? What did you find out about the loss of voice? And then another, you can see my question isn't really fully shaped here. There is this other area of permission. People who have a voice, but they don't feel permitted to express it. So that's another way of finding your voice. It's maybe you don't need the permission, but there's something about the way you were raised that shut your voice down because you didn't feel permitted. So in this whole area of finding your voice, if any one of you or all of you might say something about your experience with that loss of voice, finding voice, permitting the voice.
I teach students a couple of things. Ken Robinson, if you heard him, he has a really excellent talk on this whole idea of children. When they start off young, they are geniuses, and they have tests, right? They're geniuses because they think outside of the box. And as they go up, by the time they leave high school, they are not only not geniuses, they are just like the bottom, because we've beat their voice out of them. They're wrong. When we tell the student, you're wrong, that was a wrong thought, that was a wrong way of thinking, and when you think about culturally students coming in that are in opposition to the mainstream culture, then they're wrong. And so that they begin to lose that voice. So when they come into my class, I show them Ken Robinson, and I show them Princier, if you know Princier at all. He has a lot of rap songs. He's a wonderful he uses poetry and music and just kind of a political voice out there. And he talks about, like Ken Robinson, that the educational system has really harmed us. And that, this idea that you can't have a fish climb a tree and tell it, it's a bad fish. And so it's kind of a re-education that I take my students through in terms of saying this we're pulling back the curtains, right, to the Oz, and you see that it's not real. And we need to find what's the reality. Your voice is the reality, and you can speak, and you do have a space. And so it's part of us as educators, engaging them in that, educating them, letting them know that, that shutout has happened. It has occurred. It is not them. It was not that they are the ones that dropped the ball. We dropped the ball. So we need to pick that back up again. So I think there's a re-education that needs to happen.
I have to agree with Teresa. I also think about small children. They're born with their voice that they have, and we often tell them, no, that's inappropriate. Don't be yelling. Don't be saying things, or don't do this, don't do that. And we begin to shut down that voice for them. So that when they do reach the K through 12 level, then they don't know what their voice is. Because we've been telling them to shape their voice in a certain way. And I can also think about myself as well. Living I'm the only female in a very Mexican family, and having to hear or listen
You're
to
the only female in the Mexican family?
in my immediate family, with my parents and my two brothers, but I'm the only female daughter. Sorry, I should say the only daughter, and needing to shut down my own voice because of listening to my parents or listening to my father, or needing to be the good Mexican daughter. And I've seen that with many of my students as well, and not just the female students, but the male students, trying to fit the form of what society is telling them to shape their voice in. And so for me, bringing in people of color who have found their voice or revisited a voice that they had shut down at one point, creates that space for them as well to open up their own voice.
So how did you find your voice?
For me, it was just reading other people of color, Andrés, for the most part, for me as well. Yeah.
I feel sometimes like 25% of my job as an educator is providing some sort of therapy for students, because they have been told so many times that they've been doing it wrong and that they didn't do it right. And so when they enter the classroom, classroom, they're already up against their own doubts that have been kind of ingrained into them by instructors or by their parents or by themselves or by society or whatever. And so part of my job, the way I see it, is kind of breaking that down. And how do I do it? Yeah, I try to bring work that's relatable to them. I try to show them experiences that maybe they are familiar with. But I think that students have their voice. It's not necessarily helping them find it, it's helping them reclaim it. And you do that by providing them these tools, these work like by Montoya, and marrying it with other tools like I mentioned that Shitty First Draft essay, right? The main theme of that essay is just write it down, right? And students are afraid that if I'm starting the wrong way. No, you're not, just write. You know, and so a lot of it is just kind of giving the students the confidence to reclaim their voice.
I think that everyone's kind of touched on it, that I do think that, you know, it's through especially for students of color, it's through that institutional and structural racism that exists in K through 12 that really is built to, you know, make you fall in line, you know, and shut down that voice. And I think to Juan's point about, it's about reclaiming it, that I'm sure all of you in this room can think of a moment or several moments, or maybe you're doing it all the time, where you are editing yourself before you speak out loud. And that is that's social construction, right? You're editing things before you speak out loud. And so or you're editing yourself or your actions or your emotions, right? Through your process of interacting with people. And I mean, some of it is necessary, but most of it is probably not necessary. We're doing it because we were taught to conform to some sort of, you know, structure that we're told that we need to fit in, but we don't really fit in that, especially as people of color. And then whatever our other intersections are, right? If we start adding gender and classism and LGBTQIA, etc., how do we still fit into the same box, right? And I think that through all that process, right, voice gets lost, right? I can think of a short story that I wrote, and I don't remember when I wrote it, but the characters in the short story I wrote, the guy's name was Connor, and the woman's name was Zoe, right? And I just finished grading my students' fiction short stories, and I noticed that although I have a majority students of color, the characters in their stories' names are all these really Anglo names, right? And it's part of that same thing. It's they're writing they're modeling what they've been reading, right? And what they've been taught. In terms of using writing to find voice, I do think Nancy's point of I'm still continuing to struggle to find voice, right? And right now I'm doing this thing where I keep writing poems where I question the poem. And I question why I'm writing the poem and the memory that I'm having, right? Because it's not something I used to do because I used to feel like it wasn't okay to have that voice inside of a poem, right? But I think that reading other writers teaches us that. Something that my students noticed with those 5 poems that I teach as a set from Andrés is the male students noticed it really quickly, and I was like, oh, I just said what word appears in every poem, and it's the word despair. That in particular, that was a big word that I wanted them to look at. But before that, the male students in the class were there's a lot of tears or weeping or crying, right? And even in that, Andrés is subverting what we understand to be masculinity, right? And I think that that's him creating his own voice even with that, right? And the students noticed it right away. And so I do think that if we provide them as much of a landscape to work with, that it will help them realize their own. But I don't think that it's a simple struggle, because like I said, I'm still struggling with voice even now. And I don't know if people can perceive that when they see my work, but I am, and I know through my editing process that I am.
There was one more question. Thank you all. Thank you, Hales.